The issue before us is the constraints in the budget, how difficult this budget is going to be to implement. And the point I sought to make, and it's not new, I think we all know by now the conversation, loud conversation that has been going on, that for the last 2 years and going into next year, all the tax revenues that, sorry, not just tax, all the total revenue that we have been collecting cannot pay government workers who are on government payroll and other agencies like universities, departments and others on the same payroll, plus interest that we are paying on our loans. And so if these two items cannot be covered by total budgets, and I'm emphasizing total budget, and I'll come back to it. If these two items, we cannot pay these two items only, what we call compensation. Compensation is wages and allowances for public servants on the government's payroll, and we should get that clear. It's not like, wages for the whole economy. Of course, government does not employ everybody. It is not like wages for state-owned enterprises who pay their own workers, even though they are public servants. And those who are self-accounting, these are wages for ministries, departments, and agencies on the budget only. If we add interest that we are paying, and again, emphasis, we are not talking about the principal. When you go and borrow, and we all do borrow, you pay interest and then you pay the principal over time. So we are not talking about the principal yet. So these two items are so large that we cannot pay them from total revenue. And the reason I'm emphasizing total revenue is that that when we collect our total revenue, we have to earmark some. We have to appropriate some. Parliament does, and the laws to get funds to NHIL, to the statutory funds. Those are the statutory funds. We have to put part of that revenue coming from the oil. In fact, all of it first into the petroleum funds, and then it is split, between GMPC and then the Heritage Fund, Stabilization Fund, which two items, the Heritage and Stabilization Funds, cannot be used, but we have the budget funds. So Parliament authorizes, and that is another issue that is pending because we lowered the amount that goes to the statutory funds, the stabilization fund, and we have not yet brought it back. And that means that we are not well prepared for the next crisis. We can discuss that also, going forward. But the point I'm making for all of this is that if you do not meet your revenues, your compensation and your interest, then what does it mean? It means that Ghana has to borrow to finish paying those two items. Ghana has to borrow to pay for the budget that is devoted, we call it recurrent expenditure, sometimes together with these two, to run government offices. That is to buy stationery, to buy, the normal things which you use to run, any government office. Government also has to fuel vehicles, to buy stationery and all those things. Then you also have to borrow to pay for capital, which is what the only item we normally, ideally, should be borrowing to finance. But here we are borrowing to finance these two, these other items as well. Then next, you also have to borrow to pay arrears for the current year. Arrears, so in other words, arrears that will be carried from 2021 at the end of 2021. We will also have to borrow to pay for those in 2022 after Parliament. This is one of the approvals that Parliament must give. Then finally, you have to, and of course, you know that when we talk about arrears, let me backtrack a bit. You know, the current government has been excluding the bailout costs, but they have been including ESLA revenue. So if they exclude the bailout costs as arrears, then now, and you have added the ESLA, which is a source of paying, if you remember the ESLA bond and the rest, then it means that the current item must also borrow. Of course, there is the ESLA bond. If we have used what we borrowed already, then we have to borrow, to pay for the energy costs, to pay for the bank costs, and then, of course, contractors and a few agencies who also benefit from the ESLA. Then finally, we have to borrow to pay for previous debt. That's what we call amortization, which normally is also absorbed in the budget. So this is a scenario, that is facing us, continuing to borrow to do a lot of things. But we also know that our debt levels have reached 80%, and not just, excuse me, not just Ghanaians, but now international agencies like the World Bank, the African Development Bank. If we are scared of the IMF, they've also pointed it out. So we must enter that conversation. The ratings agencies have told us that our debt is ballooning, and the most senior figure in the multilateral agencies and international arena to point out to this is the president of the World Bank, which gives us a lot of significant resources, particularly for development expenditure, and gives us concessional loans. They've expressed concern. And Ghana, following COVID, of course, we got some money for COVID, but we are not in a scheme which is being run by the group of 20. Let's get it clear. It is not the IMF alone. It is we provide technical support for them. We are talking about the group of countries, 20 countries that are the richest. Frank with Ghanaians, which is why, for example, I was said to be too open, with figures and with governance. So that we spoke about the two items. You remember compensation, right, and interest. Now, government has to find money to pay that interest. And remember, I spoke about amortization, that is repayment of the principal. Government has to find money, that is loans, to pay the entire amortization and interest. Otherwise, Ghana will default. We are already considered to the default. So if we are not able to, if assuming we pay for that, excuse me, then are we able to pay compensation? And I've told you already that total revenue from GRA to fees, charges, grants, even if you add what you go to statutory funds, we still leave a balance. That is the second most critical item, is wages. So the truth is it about new employment or even the ability to pay those who are on current government payroll? I get my point. It is not about being gracious. It's not about looking for new, money to create jobs. How do you create jobs? And this is one of the differences between the past government and the current one. We believe the way to create jobs is to, have a fiscal space so you can do infrastructure. And that's a more sustainable way of creating jobs, especially now that we have come to appreciate why that angle is better. Is that when you put, employees on only government payroll as a means of creating jobs, the debate over NAPCO, you get to a point where you cannot pay them because you've expanded the payroll. The capacity, of the employees in terms of, job spaces used to be, I think, 500,000, and it increased to 550,000. Today we're talking about 600 and 650,000. And so you must just position this with the discussions going on what do you do with NAPCO. And if the essence of that, of the levy is to be channeled for these, then let's be clear, we are talking about even existing employees, let alone new, employees that will be created. And of course, if you cannot borrow to do your infrastructure and the rest, then that is where the issue is. Now, the second point on this is that Ghana needs, by the government's own budget, needs to borrow, that's when we talk about the deficit, needs to borrow 37 billion Ghana cedis to meet all these requirements. That is what the deficit means. Now, because of some the treatment of certain items, which some of us are contending, that amount could go up to 42 or to even 43 billion. Let me give you one example. The budget is making provision to pay arrears of only 1.9 billion. So now you and I know from what contractors are saying, and from others who are owed by government, IPPs and the rest, that the arrears is far in excess of that amount. So maybe mid-year we shall adjust, and and get money to pay those, which is why it is low. Even the government itself in the budget, if you remember, has said that, we are going to, they will be deferring arrears and pay them over a period of 2 to 3 years. So is it abated arrears we are talking about? And what is the real figure? And that negotiation has also started. Now, wages negotiations, part of it were stalled going into the budget. And so I think we should have some clarity. In other words, what I'm saying simply is that if you compare that, you have to go to the market to borrow, 40 billion plus, or if I give the benefit of doubt to government, 37 billion, then what is 6.9 billion in that context? Right? So that is, even if you enacted a e-levy and you raise that amount of money, right? Yes, maybe it may be compensation, but there is a larger headache that is facing us, whether the government can borrow, to pay for the rest of the items which are listed, including, so that amount may hold the fort for paying government, workers. In other that, we do not, we are unable, I don't know when this ever happened, to pay, government workers. So this is a stark reality. I think we need transparency on that. I think it is not, a gratuitous exercise at all in terms of creation, of jobs. The budget is so constrained. We are even thinking about how to borrow for recurrent expenditure, which we call current expenditure, or annual expenditure, expenditures that are paid normally.
So to you, the biggest concern is even whether or not you are able to generate the revenues you need to pay the workers that are currently on your payroll, not the new employment that you are going to generate.
Well, unless you are going to borrow, remember, if you owe IPPs, if you owe, let's say even government workers, who some of whom on an annual basis, sorry, on a monthly basis, take part of that, salary and give it to, to restock and to expand the kiosk or other things that they have, which is a form of small scale job creation. And if you don't pay contractors, then you are losing jobs. You are not creating jobs. You are losing jobs. And that's how we must see it. Because if you don't pay contractors, they have to lay off the workers, right? And of course, God forbid, if you don't pay, if you don't generate the revenue to pay, workers, then you are not paying even current workers. How do you add on, the government, right? And some of these arrears may be owed, of course, increasing, petroleum prices at the pump because we are unable to pay subsidy from the scenario which I have painted. That is one of it. And we cannot reduce, levies like ESLA, which should have lasted 5 years because we have mortgaged the ESLA revenues to secure loans which must be repaid over, say, 10 years. So I think we must have a plain conversation on some of these issues so that Ghanaians will appreciate the difficulty which the government is going through. But that's that's the first of my concerns. But if you permit me, the second of my major concerns, because there are many concerns, but the second of my major concerns is that the stalemate over the 7 billion, if I may just approximate it, from the e-levy is stopping Parliament from doing its work. And so now we were at stage 1, or let's say stage 2. Stage 1 is the presentation of the budget, which the minister did. Stage 2 is approval of government's economic policy, which forming the basis for the estimates. That is forming the basis for the money that is expected to be generated and which Parliament must appropriate. That is the next stage, and I'll come back to that. So we haven't gone through, if you like, this phase 2, where we are stuck because of the e-levy. Now, what will happen if we do not move to stage 3, or if we rush in moving to stage 3, because by the time maybe a compromise is struck, it may be the middle of the week, and I'm sure by now there are a lot of negotiations that are taking place, in the background. The first, optimistic outlook is that Parliament will have to rush because Parliament will go on recess, for the Christmas. Normally, the latest which the Mahama administration had gone or have gone in terms of leading budget discussions. I remember the budget is presented on behalf of the president, so as minister, you cannot own it. Now, the latest that we have gone was 23rd of December, just in time for the Christmas Eve, which is, and then Parliament goes on recess. So if today is the 6th, I believe today is the 6th, and yes, and you subtract that from December 23 days that was available, assuming that this had been done, last week, the 1 week, you are left with 17 days. And that is already being constrained by the volume of work that has to be done in phase 3. Phase 3 means the elements of the budget for ministries, departments, and agencies, and for all those GNPC and the rest who are going to get money from the budget, has been referred to committees. Of course, now we don't know whether it's null and void because of, the action of rejection and approval. But that is the basis. But assuming that we find a solution, then those elements of the budget for the ministries, their departments and agencies, and others who are getting money from the budget must go to the committees of the House. And the committees must now meet the ministers who are in charge of those ministries, departments, and agencies. And they come with their senior officials and heads of the agencies to defend their budget. First of all, the policies, which is the statement now, what they want to do, like employment, which we were discussing. So I can imagine the discussion in the finance committee is what I am creating. I'm talking about. What is it that the e-levy is going to pay for? Is it existing wages, considering that current total revenue cannot meet it? Or is it about a new employment? Those are some of the questions, where do we go with energy? Where do we go with, subsidy? Does it mean there will be no subsidies? Those are the questions that will be asked. Housing, where are we going to get the money? Are you sure you can borrow, to bring out, since the budget has become debt dependent. So, and this normally takes 2 to 3 weeks. And then these reports are brought back to the House and debated. Each report must now be approved by the House, which is why there's anxiety, because there are more approvals that have to come the way of Parliament. Now, when all this is done, and assuming that all committee reports, and you've in the past you've heard about minority reports being submitted if there's no consensus, and then the debate is lengthy. It is only when all this is done that the whole reports are put together and referred to finance committee, which then comes back with a recommendation and the bill, that is the draft law, which Parliament must approve. And it is only then, that the government has approval to spend. Now, let me point out why I have the concern. The 2021 budget, which is holding government and the nation now, not just government, holding the nation now in terms of government services. So we're talking about, let me explain for the benefit again of those who might find this to be technical. The money to pay teachers, the money to pay government doctors, the money to pay nurses, right? The money to pay the government offices in every district where you work to, agric offices, and the education service and everything. The money to pay all those, will come to an end in 2021, because the 2021 budget would lapse 31st December completely. And so if we do not resolve this stalemate, and there is the sign of continuous, Parliament will have to rush, or the worst, and God forbid, is that you will not have a budget for 2022. And there will be a government shutdown, because there will be no law to back, revenues, even though some revenue, like what GRA is collecting, may be coming in, but you cannot appropriate because there's no law. That is how critical and important a budget is. So we are seeing another aspect of something we have taken for granted, because things were running smoothly. It didn't mean that there were no difficulties in discussing budget. It's a very difficult discussion, right? But a discussion that must be had by the government. And let me say that during our administration, there was an occasion when we nearly did not have the numbers to take the vote, as happened, but then ministers and others were in town, they rallied, and we had the vote. So that's why I say that the public in general has taken this for granted. But now we are at a point where we must use the opportunity to also educate and understand, the party faithfuls, and the implications is what I'm talking about. Party faithfuls, the public at large, to understand, and that we have had or been fortunate, unlike other countries, even developing countries, to have had our parliament on an annual basis pass the budget without the stalemate that we are having today.
Having said that, the whole stalemate is over basically one item. The other ones we understand have already been dealt with. Is the e-levy. Now, I was reading this morning a position by Bryce Simmons, who is from civil society, who is even cautioning the minority leader to hold his horses for even mentioning 1% as perhaps an agreeable position. It says no, the minority leader cannot say that. They are asking for a total withdrawal of the e-levy. Now, in this position that the finance minister finds himself in, do you think it was the best thing to have done? Because Bryce Simon is also of the opinion that something like the e-levy is a policy, is a major policy that you're introducing. It should not be introduced in the budget.
Policy.
It should not be introduced in the budget. And that it should have been, there should have been consultation on it. Do you agree?
No, first of all, let's follow process. Well, yes, I have written, if you remember, I have written that the e-levy is not the most favorable tool, that must be used to generate revenues, and that government has been using some unorthodox means of trying to raise revenue, like blocking, the input tax which businesses, credits and refunds which businesses pay on input tax for VAT. They blocked it. That is what changing the GET fund and the NHIL, from a de facto VAT, to so-called straight levies. That's what it means. Now, when that is done, it means that the cost of these inputs that was reducing the cost of production has been cancelled. That's what it meant. And therefore, what they cannot recover, they've been passing on, right? The government has also increased the ESLA. We're talking about the ESLA. We're not talking about only extending it beyond the 5 years. But remember, on 2 occasions, the ESLA, levies were increased in 2019, in particular, which I remember, right? And then fees and other things are being increased. Now, the way the e-levy is designed follows the same thing, because when you impose a levy on business and business cannot recover it, right? Is it a tax on capital of those businesses? Or is it, a tax on consumption? And remember that even if business cannot push it over, it is a legitimate cost of doing business because it's an indirect tax. And it will be added to cost. If it cannot be recovered, then it will mean that it will be counted as expenditure. And what you gained ahead by way of indirect taxes, you will lose when businesses come to pay their corporate income taxes. Because they are free to, to deduct it, as an expense. The consumer, on the other scenario, is not free, cannot do that because they are not in business. So they have to bear it in the form of higher prices, which comes with inflation, and others, right? And difficulties. Now, let me address process. And I am not a lawyer, but I know Bryce is a lawyer, but my understanding from experience and the little law, I mean, no qualified lawyer, but I did some tax law, is that it's only Parliament that can enact a law to introduce a tax or a levy or even a fee. That's the Income and Fees Act now makes it, which we introduce to avoid a haphazard way in which, fees and charges are raised. I think in 2013 or 20 or even earlier, the Income and Fees Act was put in place. So one is only Parliament that can impose a tax under Article 13 of the Constitution. It's a constitutional requirement. Now, but how do you do that? You do that by going to Parliament. And for most taxes, because you do not want it to disrupt, by bringing them, surprise business and everything, you normally bring it through the budget. And those are what we call, when the budget is read, the finance bills. So I think that where we are now is that if it had been approved, or as you are saying, if other items have been approved and includes, taxes, and in fact, even the removal of a tax is a waiver of a tax. You remember the debate over the road tolls, that the Minister for Finance or the Minister for Roads have not got the power, to do that. It's only Parliament that can waive or exempt taxes. Right. Now, so if those have been accepted, let's say the road tolls and others, tax measures have been accepted, then that process can continue. And the process means that the proposals, remember what I said, would have been referred to Finance Committee, and Finance Committee will come with a bill or a draft law which Parliament would approve to either remove or not remove the tax, the tax. So as we speak now, there's no legal basis, for the road tolls until Parliament has gone through that. And that also involves, another approval. And that's the reason why, we must have some compromise, because even if the minority returns to Parliament, right, they will have the opportunity to vote. And some of the votes are not just simple majority. It's not just one vote that you can use to get it. Even if you can get all the 138 members, reported, some must be passed by two-thirds majority. And this is why consensus building in Parliament is very important. Because if it's two-thirds, you definitely, with a tight, situation like that, you need, a number of MPs on the other side to vote for certain important constitutional, changes and bills and things to be met. Right. So I'm afraid the process is right in that it must be introduced in Parliament, right? But then it is the prerogative of Parliament to approve. And this is where policy comes in. And I think what is happening is that, what the NDC is saying is that, just as, in the past, some taxes which are currently in existence were called nuisance taxes, and the minority called for their removal. You can imagine if we didn't have ESLA today, we are still not able to even pay, depositors and the energy sector which the ESLA is supporting, right? So the point, Senna, is that back to the point, the issue you raised. The process is ongoing, and that is what the debate is all about. Whether or not me and you agree that this tax is obnoxious and should not come in, it would only increase the burden, of consumers, who are already suffering directly from, say, ESLA, which has been increased, and indirectly from blocking the input tax on Get Fund and NHIL. It is only Parliament which can decide that. And therefore, that is why the issue is before Parliament.
But
so the minority, in other words, what I'm saying is that, the minority leader is, on the spot because the issue is for Parliament. But I am only widening the conversation and saying that without any consensus, with government can come to with other consensus, which is agreeable, to move the process forward.
Because Bryce's point is that I don't know how the budget process goes, but I'm guessing if you are, whilst you are putting together the budget, you have consultations, you have conversations with people in civil society, and sometimes even the opposition on the budget. Or do you put together the budget and just the very first day everybody gets to hear about it is the day when you present it in Parliament? Has that always been the procedure?
Well, we do consultations. Yeah, we do consultations. I don't want to go to the extreme and say that any government which wastes power from the people should not do consultations. And therefore, even if the Constitution says that it's only the Minister for Finance, or the President can take the bill to Parliament, yes, you can decide that this is the power of the President and can exercise it. But I know that the Ministry of Finance does, consultations. In fact, I think it is even advertised. So again, we must begin to take note of some of these things now. That how wide is that, advertisement for soliciting views, such that, civil society and others can bring in their inputs. If you do not do that, follow that process, which has become convention in the Ministry of Finance, and I'm aware that, such a notice, was issued, because I follow, because of course I do teach some of these to students and the rest. If it was not done, it's one thing issuing a notice and you are in the media, so you know what I'm talking about. It's one thing issuing consultations, another thing, propagating it, through the FM stations and the rest. Another thing, engaging key CSOs for a discussion. If that process fails, it does not take away the prerogative of Parliament, to increase taxes, or to waive taxes, or to reduce, taxes. That is the prerogative of Parliament under, Chapter 13 of the Constitution. The whole of Chapter 13 is devoted, to only these finance issues.
Well, whilst there may be an issue of governance, because you're talking about a possible shutdown of government, whilst that may be staring us in the face, there are those who have also argued, and you can see from the pressure on the NDC caucus in Parliament, because a lot of people feel that the MPP caucus essentially will go with the government, and the pressure on them is that reject the e-levy. Now, there are those who argue that the government should have backed down when the budget was disapproved on Friday. All the government needed to do was pull out the budget, see if it can make some changes, and resubmit it for a conversation on it. That the insistence on going with the e-levy will only entrench positions, and it looks like at this point in time, the NDC caucus, as long as it says no, does have a sizable chunk of civil society on its side, and also a lot of Ghanaians, including even MPP members, on its side. Do you agree that the approach used by the government is also not helpful?
You see, this may be one of the points which Brad Simmons is talking about. Because you are an MP, look, I don't believe that it is all MPs on government side, right, who may not be concerned about this levy. Don't we have those who send money through Momo, which is quick from the city when mommy is sick, when a child is sick, when fees have to be paid, and you're in the city and you have to send money, to rural areas and the rest where it has permitted, where in the past you have to go to a lorry station to look for somebody and give the money, hand over the money. Like I used to do many years back, go to the station, look around to see if somebody, or call a friend, are you going home this weekend? Can you take money to my mother? I mean, this is the convenience of Momo, right? So unless you're telling me that the MPs on that side, on the majority side, are immune, to all of these concerns. The concern is not just one for the NDC, right? And so if they have not done adequate consultation and cannot judge the pulse of the nation, I do not think that the issue is just one for the NDC. And of course, the NDC is in opposition. And that's the role of the NDC, to highlight these things. So the majority MPs can be whipped, to vote for this levy. But I perceive, and looking at the sentiments, by the way, if we can, go back to history, looking at the sentiments around taxation, the important one I want to mention because of my personal involvement in it and the involvement of prominent people, in the position today, was VAT, right? And not even, and at the point, what it led to, kumi prekun, semi prekun, and all those prekuns. That was an opposition to a tax. The NDC at the time had the numbers. They could also have said that, let us also push it through Parliament. But I believe the NDC at the time listened, and withdrew the VAT. And then reintroduced it. And consulted, why? I didn't mean that we did not consult. So, I mean, we do. And you have the Boston Tea Party and others in advanced countries where, voters, are opposed to certain taxes, and it becomes a big issue. I'm talking about these tea parties, the US. You also have even current situations where there are plates, car plates, which have for the residents of DC who are not represented, in Parliament, and whom it raised taxation without representation. So I'm afraid we shouldn't, just because the government is able to whip all of its MPs to vote for the measure, does not necessarily mean that, it is popular. It may be popular with the base. It may be the way it is presented that, hey, look, then this is just obstructing, government work. We need the money, as you have said, and whatever. Yes, but ultimately, are we saying that it's only NDC supporters who will pay the tax? No, I believe the issue, the implications of this tax is wider. And whilst I'm on said, let me just mention that there has been attempts to compare, the e-levy, with the VAT on non-core financial services. It was not all financial services. The VAT was not to be imposed on interest. No, that is savings. And the VAT was not to be imposed on loans and things, transactions, and the rest. No. And that's why the input, it was to be imposed on non-core financial services, like the fees which banks charge, for services that they render, which is the same as if you go to an accountant and they charge you a service, you pay VAT on it, right? If you go to an agricultural service, important as agriculture is, and you go and you go and buy agricultural input, or you get somebody who is a professional to come and inspect your cocoa farm, or what is done by government and others, there's VAT on some of those services, and things already, because they are not expressly excluded unless it can be classified as agriculture basic food. Now, but the VAT has a mechanism of making sure that when a business pays for the tax on inputs, they are getting a credit. So you cannot compare the VAT just because we made it unpopular under Kumi Prepu and the rest. No, you cannot compare the VAT to any of the levies that are being imposed now. The straight levy, which is blocking that input tax, the CST, which is blocking the input tax, which was also brought in, by the right of central government, right of central government. You cannot compare them to those levies, because it shows a certain misunderstanding of why VAT was introduced and why we had Kumi Prepu, to a certain extent, that it was not understood, and it's still not understood by that tradition, that when you impose a VAT, you are removing taxes which were paid on inputs, so that businesses will not treat it as a cost and pass it on to consumers. So when you are bringing a tax which is inferior to this approach, you don't say that, your tax, the NDC introduced, a VAT, and therefore, they cannot oppose the imposition of e-levy. And let me come even to further from behind and point to ESLA, which was supposed to, pay for, the energy sector, debt, and by that, as we did with VRA, pay depositors. We were told that it was a nuisance tax, it needs to go, only for it to be retained, right? Only for it to be retained. And then even make it go beyond, beyond what the period that was fixed for it. So, Senator, I'm afraid, no, the comparisons are not, and it's not only NDC. The comparisons are not, the comparisons do not have much merit, and then secondly, I think it is not just NDC supporters, for that matter, who would have to pay the mumu, and for which reason, it's only the opposition that's not going to parliament. So the evaluation will come. I believe there were demonstrations and things like that, and businesses are expressing concern. When the VAT input tax credit was withdrawn, I remember very well that there were statements issued by Chamber of Commerce and the rest. And of course, the government had a majority, even a larger majority then, went ahead with it. It doesn't make it right. Just because you have, the majority does not mean. And we've just been talking about what Brad Simmons, spoke about. Do we know? Are we sure that there were consultations held, before the e-levy? I think that's the point he's making. And therefore, it's not just a point for NDC is also a point as to whether even the supporters of NDC who are going to be paying the charges of Momo were also consulted.
You started talking about the e-levy. In fact, you were questioning whether it was the right approach to use at this time. And I go back to Bryce Simmons again, and it's something that an argument that a lot of people have made. I think Kojocho Mbuafo famously said, "What is on Momo is not new money." Bryce Simmons also talks about the simplistic nature of the analysis that's been made by government, where he says that you're just looking at the transactions and calculating 1.5% on a certain threshold and saying that you make this amount of money. There's also the issue of the government's own digitization agenda and the impact it will have on it in terms of people using it for electronic transactions, which were actually encouraging to reduce cash movements, among others. You described it at some point, you weren't so specific, where you said the most nuisance of all nuisance taxes. That's your position?
How specific would I have to go? Right? Yes, it is. And I've just said why I feel, as a professional, tax professional, I'm making a case that, it's worse than the VAT, which was opposed by this tradition. You know what I mean? Tradition, you know what I mean? All this opposition to VAT since Kumi Preko. And I'm saying that, when Kojo and others are pointing bright, are saying that it's not all Momo that is consumption. That was a point I raised. And I asked, for example, on my Twitter handle, what is e-levy? And I asked the same thing, what is the street levy? Is it a tax on capital? Because yes, as they are saying, it's not all Momo transactions, which is consumption. If I send money, if I'm in Accra and I send money to pay for workers on my farm, for workers, in my shop or whatever, right? I'm not consuming, I'm paying wages. I'm encouraging business transactions. So it's not consumption. And what VAT sought to do, was to say that, wait a minute, VAT is a consumption tax. And so let us deduct, any tax that is paid on business inputs, any tax that's paid on capital. So for example, if you Senna goes today, not to buy a car, is different from Radio Gold going to buy a car. If you Senna goes to buy a car or to buy a motorcycle or anything, you pay VAT. If Radio Gold goes to buy a car, they will also pay VAT. But Radio Gold as a business will be allowed to deduct the VAT they paid on the car from the advertisement and other fees that you earn, which you are charging to. And if you charge even that advert to a business, that business can deduct it because it's a tax on the business that they are not consumers. So ultimately, VAT sanitizes all these taxes on input, on capital, on everything, and says you have a right to deduct them. So that by the time the goods go to the consumer, it would have been taken off. Otherwise, the consumer is going to pay 17.5% on the cost plus the taxes that they enacted. So we are saying the same thing. Remember, I was careful to make a distinction. I wasn't in opposition to what Bryce said at all. And let me reiterate that, right? Both as a professional, I agree and I've been writing, so I'm not backtracking on anything that I've said. No. I was only also making a distinction between the process and saying that the consultation is necessary, yes, but they can go to Parliament without that consultation, and that is due process. That is part of the process. There's a bit of, I don't think that there is. Sorry, I must be careful here. I think that the PFMA we did ask for consultations, yes, but how wide was that consultations done? Is a question that was being raised. So I was trying to make a distinction between the obnoxious nature of the levy, right, and the process. And by the way, did you know that before the VAT was introduced, the Internal Revenue Service was collecting taxes? These services that we are talking about were collecting these service taxes, and they were already replaced by the VAT, which is why one of the controversial issues was what was an appropriate rate, for the VAT at the time. Because VAT was not an entirely new tax. There were taxes on goods called the sales tax, taxes on services. The first one was being collected by Customs Department at the time, or the Customs SEPs, as we call them at the time. And the second one was being collected by the Internal Revenue Service on a narrow base. Yes. And all of these were put together, right, to introduce the VAT. So what are we talking about? What is the preaching that we are hearing today? Those who oppose that are now reintroducing it. Then where is the clarity in what was done in the past? Right? The taxes that were consolidated, right, were put as part of the VAT and enacted so that businesses can get their input tax credit, are now being reintroduced again, right, without that credit. Which is a superior approach? That's the question.
But also, as a tax person, do the assumptions sound tidy enough for you that we are projecting that we are planning to make 6.9 billion Ghana cedis from Momo alone this year?
This is why we must not rush the debate, right? I have said, for example, that the total revenue, when you are increasing revenue, assuming that you meet the 70 billion you say you want to collect in 2021, right? And you say you want to increase it to 100 billion. I've already said that it's ambitious. If you see the document that's going around, because it's half of the revenue that you are collecting. You are struggling to collect 70 billion. And then you say in 2022, you want to collect, 100 billion. So I've raised some of these questions. But the point I'm making is that this is why this whole scenario, should not rush Parliament, because the question you are asking is exactly what the Finance Committee will ask. What data did you collect? What data did you collect from MTN, from Vodafone, and the rest where these transactions originate, right? And how much of it, and I would have asked how much of it, is paid by businesses, which will be passed on to consumers, and how much of it is paid directly to the consumer. And are you sure that when the Momo is sent to the consumer, it is not, a wife sending money for school fees? So is it what? A charge on school fees? Right? So those are the questions which, and were all these considered, were they all these to be exempted or what? And if business has to be given the credit, then why are you not, is it because you need the money that you are not using the VAT to do it? Right? So yes, so that they can get their input tax credit. So Senator, you raised a very important point, but in order that it must be debated, carefully, and even I do not have all because extensive work is done by GRA to show whether this can be, and our Finance Committee, GRA will be there with the minister to answer some of these technical questions that you are raising. And that's why the process in Parliament is also very important, and it should not be rushed on account of the stalemate that we are going through, with the e-levy.
Thanks for coming back to, because you were just talking about the revenue expectations. The analysis you made, you were saying that you even expect that the amount of money we may need to borrow may rise to over 40 billion. Right now, we are saying 37 billion, based on the fact that we are planning to raise 100 billion Ghana cedis of revenue.
But remember, Senator, the point is that even that 100 billion, as ambitious as it is, it's not enough to pay. And that's why we need another 40 billion.
And I was coming to ask you,
another 40 billion. Yes.
I was coming to ask you, because there are people who are saying, if you look at the 40 billion, If we are even able to raise 70 billion this year, you're looking at 43% increase in our tax revenue, in our that we are targeting.
Yes, we did that. We did, yeah, we put out those numbers. We normally put out those budget numbers also. And remember, these were part of our pre-budget, and even when we evaluated the budget, for 2021, which I've been doing on my professional handle, the PFM Tax Africa. So yes, I know about these numbers, and that's why I'm raising them.
And I was coming to ask you. You've been finance minister, you've been a tax person for a larger part of your life. Put it together. For the 43% target within the circumstances, realistic?
Senna, I already pointed out that even that amount, we know it's not enough. It's not realistic, because why are we saying it's not realistic? Now, when you express it in nominal terms, it's huge. GRA is bringing 70 billion, right? And then you are adding 40 billion, which is two-thirds, about half, close to half of what, they are collecting now. 70, and it's collecting 100, so 30. If you're able to collect the 70, which we estimate, which often we are not able to meet, right? Half of that should be 35. And you are adding half of that amount for GRA to collect. That's where I'm coming from. I say it's not realistic. And then, again, pardon me to be a bit, technical at this point, you express it as a percentage of output, because it's just a nominal figure, which can be big. And when you express it as a percentage of a nominal figure, you will see that, it's higher. You are jumping from 16% of GDP, that's the output, to 22%, or 17% of GDP to 22%. You are going to increase revenue, by 6 percentage points of GDP in a year. It's not possible, because many countries do, unless, of course, there's a bonanza like oil revenue. That's why government holds things up the sleeve, which we may not all know, but which they have to disclose to Parliament, right? But the ordinary people like me, as I am now, may not know, but I just have the insight, right? So that's the perspective from which I'm saying it's not realistic. And that is because you can go back to 2012, which is when the rebasing was done in 2013. That's why I don't like going further back, because I'm opposed to people comparing nominal figures after you have rebased. So if we take it from the rebase period, 2012, 2013, to date, we've not been able to exceed 18% of total revenue of GDP. So how are you going to, do, 22%? But Senator, that is because, and let me raise another point. I said I had two concerns. Actually, the third one, which is very important, is that we are not having expenditure debates. We are not having expenditure discussions. Because what are the taxes being spent on? Expenditure. And it is not enough, and we are borrowing another 40 billion. So again, my analogy, a household, excuse me, your salary is 100, right? And your expenditure, important as it may seem to you, is 140, 150. And you are borrowing perpetually, and you are not able to raise that 100, right? Okay, if you are raising the money, you sit down and you question yourself, right? What expenditure can we take out? Of course, we don't want to take out food. Of course, we want to sacrifice, even if it means borrowing and repaying, to take the children to school, right? So that they can have a brighter future, like some of us have compared to our parents who were in marketplaces and the rest. So we want to make that sacrifice. So if a parent is making those, they sit down. So, okay, yeah, the furniture is, it's worn out, but maybe we can, it's not too bad. Why don't we use it another year or so? And then the first child would have finished school, then we can have some room, to do that. This is a conversation. Government is no different. And I'm saying we are not having expenditure debates. And so we are assuming that we can raise revenues, and every year we say we can raise so much, and then we come back and we are imposing taxes. If it's expenditure, then let's have a discussion on expenditure. Again, we did it. And so I'm able to talk about it. It's not like you are saying something which cannot be done. That's what the whole forum and the whole Takrady fora were all about. When we were faced with let me not just mention single spine, subsidy, and the rest. And then we liberalized and we started putting certain measures like the strategic stock and other things. And we realized that we were having a constraint in borrowing. So we set up the sinking fund. So on hindsight, you are beginning to see why, we started to put in certain mechanisms to resolve some of these things. And we knew because we knew the state of we did the audit. So we knew the state of the banks, were not strong. You see, on the one hand, you cannot tell me that COVID, however severe it is, has had an impact on business, and then be dismissive of the fact that the combination of the global financial crisis, doomsday, and the fall in crude oil prices could not have had any effect on the economy. And that is why you make it so simplistic and make it look like ESLA was a nuisance tax. You come in now, and increase it. Right? So let's have the expenditure debate, right? And see whether it is all the expenditure that we can finance. And I'm not saying this lightly, because we have been tracking. First, we introduced capping. So even the expenditure we are talking about, which is not enough now, part of it was capped, the majority of which went back into central government expenditure. Then we started using oil revenue, and there was opposition. So from PIAC and others, so at least part of the oil revenue is being, restored. But then the oil revenue going into the stabilization fund. We use COVID to lower it, and we have not restored. If the economy is doing so good, why haven't we brought back, so that the money can flow into the stabilization fund, so that when next time we have a crisis or we have a budget, crunch, we can. But that also has gone into expenditure, and it's continuing to go into expenditure. Sena, the IMF, we say we are hesitant. So far has given us 2 billion, 1 billion on a soft loan on account of COVID. Another one, based on the SDR, which is our own money, our capital, which is another money. That SDR is being shown as financing. So what is it financing? It's not stated. Maybe this is what will be disclosed to Parliament, just as what was being spent on COVID. It took a while for those things to be disclosed. So how come? So we are talking about this year or 2022, the IMF money is going to come in. But for that, the deficit would have been higher. And that's why we make another point that, the IMF money is making it, the deficit, which is already at 9% or even more, as people think, should have been at 5%, making it look manageable. But next year, you're not going to have that money. I mean, for 2023, you're not going to have that money. So there are issues. And these are the issues which I'm afraid, are going to be rushed, instead of a finance committee having sufficient time to discuss them.
Well, if you just join us, we're having a conversation with Honorable Seth Terkper, with former finance minister. Now, listening to you now, because there are a lot of people who are saying, you say there's COVID, but you are planning to spend, you have doubled the budget at even the presidency. You say there's COVID, but our president insists on not using the presidential jet and is flying via private jet. There are several questions that have been asked about government's own approach, its lifestyle, what can be cut, how do we reduce expenditure? Is it your suggestion that perhaps we should not keep talking about government's revenue targets? Question is, if you get them so much money, what do you intend to spend it on? Can we come back on the table? What are you spending? Which one do we cut? How do we get to the point where we don't need so much so that we can spend so much?
Precisely, because there must be an expenditure reduction exercise. We cannot tax our way, on expenditures. And yes, we did increase some taxes. We put sunset clauses on some of them, but we also, began to use, part of the oil revenue, which we could have used, to meet expenditure. We decided to put it aside for contingency fund. Today, nothing goes in the contingency fund. The sinking fund, if you look at the financing, the sinking fund is going to be drawn down to zero. I hope that is not going to go into consumption. And it is going to be used to pay down the debt, because it's a non-payment of the debt, which is making the principal, which is making us spend so much on interest. If you don't reduce the principal, your interest, would increase. Meanwhile, the principal is waiting for you. And that is what the deferral means, the refinancing. That's what it means. We were raising the point that what is the point about refinancing? Without paying it down. You are only postponing it. And this is what the World Bank president said, that Ghana is pushing the borrowing for future generations, right? And still we want to even take the heritage fund, which is for that future generation, to pay that debt instead of even using it in investment. We want to add that, to consumption. You see the something. So, Senna, let's remember that when we are talking about the public, right? Even if people are not, let's say, educated to understand the technical points and the rest that we are talking about, they are feeling it. And they know. They read the economy. I think it's the late, Jerry Rollins, who was repeated to have said that if you want to understand the economy, go to Makola. Right? So you see the questions coming up. They are not from technical people like us, right? So once you raise expenditure, you see that they're coming up and citing expenditure, which probably we should be discussing and cutting. And that is the essence of the consultation again, which Bryce Simon was talking about. Yeah.
There are several more issues to raise in terms of this budget, but the question is, what do you think should be the way forward on all this? Because you're talking about the budget and how can we get the budget passed before 2021, but it looks more likely, because one of the things you haven't spoken about is this part about there are those who have argued that there's an arrangement that you can go to Parliament, get approval to spend on account. That's a consolidated fund. Have you ever gotten to that point?
Oh, it was done in every election year is done. Every election year, you remember, because the elections take place in December, right? Sorry, because the elections take place in December. Parliament is usually on recess because the MPs are campaigning and the rest. So you see that in every election year, that one is in the constitution. And it's what we are talking about is in the constitution. In the event that you cannot, bring a budget to Parliament, you can go to Parliament, give reasons, and then the expenditure in advance of appropriation, you understand, that let's go, we discuss it. And that is the reason why after every election, the budget is ready in March. That's the only time the budget is ready in March. So it's there. Now, what may be historic is that we are using it for non-election reasons. We may go into Parliament to ask. I'm not too clear about, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I'll look at the Constitution from a layman's perspective, but it's my recollection that, that may be, and those of you who have been following from CNN and the rest, if you recall, even the U.S. Congress just announced that they had come to an agreement because they have a limit on borrowing, right? And so every year they have to go to the Secretary of the Treasury has to go to Parliament, to Congress, and they just agreed, to prevent another shutdown of the U.S. government, right? So that is where we may be headed. Those who are familiar with what is happening outside of the rest, and it is out of these things that you normally have, certain laws, which we call the fiscal rules, which we had in the Public Financial Management Act, and which this government, to its credit, said that the deficit should be 5%. Yeah, but today we're talking about deficits, above 10%. And so, yeah, we must have that debate on expenditures, because we can't be borrowing our way through, just like families cannot borrow their way. You only crash in the end. And we did crash before, and that was what HIPC is about. Although, again, at the time, there were those who felt, including, I believe, a lot, on our side, who felt that we could have, managed it because of the debt levels was rising for other reasons. But that conversation, whether you believe you can do it or not, must be had with the public and in Parliament.
After all the analysis I just heard you make, now,
but Senator, if I may,
okay,
before you go to your next question, why is one concerned about passing the budget on time? One, we are having difficulty already going back to the stock markets to borrow. We said we'll borrow 5 billion. We did 3, together with the zero coupon bond, which is an albatross waiting for us in just 2025 for us to repay all that amount. Offered a discount of over 100, million to secure one of the facilities. So instead of getting 500 coming in cash, we got only 350, right? So this is the difficulty we are facing. Uncertainty, difficulty in accessing as a result of which government is borrowing domestically. And when government borrows domestically, it is a credit that is available to government, to the whole economy that government is taking. So government is switching from foreign because that avenue is being blocked to domestic. Is that a situation we are taking into 2022? And if that is the case, again, the finance committee should ask, how much do you want to borrow from, there's an indication in it, from the domestic market? What is its effect on credits to private business? What is its effect on interest rates, right? Because private business will be competing, businesses must run. So as government comes in and is offering, borrowing rates of, let's say, 13-14%. A businessman that needs it goes to the bank and is being asked to pay 27%, which is why, again, we brought in the sinking fund. We started to reduce treasury and other, interest rates. They started going down from 2014, the current levels, but it's not going down further. So these are some of the implications of not passing the budget. We are uncertain. We are going to uncharted territory, and it will take Ghana into that territory, God forbid, which it hasn't been. Whatever difficulty there is, we've been able to surmount it. And this is why I think that I say that there's implication, for not being able to do this fully, or doing it in a way in which there's uncertainty. If you go and ask Parliament for money on account, what signals are you sending to the market? That you cannot manage your finances, you cannot even resolve it, right? And what signal? And how should they take Ghana? That's the point. And that would be a very sad development, because then our fiscal uncertainty, our economic uncertainty will begin to go into the territory, where, in Africa, we have never, even talking about Africa, not globally, we've never been before.
Key issue, and that seems to be the major blockade in terms of the passage of the budget. We've spoken about it in detail, the e-levy. Kojo Ponkroma says, if we insist that the e-levy should be taken out, it means IMF is the next place to go. In fact, you indicated a bit earlier, first you said that, well, IMF is one of the destinations that they'll be looking at. But you also said that from what you're hearing, they will try to avoid that through tax measures. They are trying to do that, and they are saying...
I've already told you that put all the tax increases together, and we are still going to borrow 40+ billion, right? I think that we should stop the IMF scare. Of course, we did a homegrown policy, and the intention was that Ghana should be able to manage its affairs with one qualification. Even Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, advanced countries at a point during the global financial crisis went to the IMF. When you hear about the peaks, the spelling of peak, which was the way to say it funnily, in the advanced countries that went to the IMF during the global financial crisis. PIG is PIG. The PIGs, the P stands for Portugal, I stands for Ireland, G stands for Greece, and the S stands for Spain. So I'm saying that economies, even the advanced ones, can be hit so hard. The US had to borrow during the global financial crisis where it originated, but they had the capacity to borrow. The only institution to which you can run for cover, and you can see that the EU itself, which even have, all the wealth and whatever, push these countries to go to the fund to have because of the expertise that the fund had. But they went out. They went out. So our homegrown policy was saying there may be time when the whole globe, like it happened with COVID, and that's why we went back to the IMF to get the COVID relief fund. The countries that are capable, the SDR, they decided to give it to other countries by way of grants so that they can get out of the crisis. So if we were capable, we would have gone back to the IMF for the COVID relief. And when you point this out, people say, hey, don't compare COVID to anything. No, but it was because of the past problems, from floods to bushfires to the global financial crisis, which was the greatest crisis and whatever. That's why certain measures were put in place, the sinking fund, the contingency fund, and the rest, which are being destroyed today. Right? So the point one is making is that, please, I don't think that, we should be, it's like a Kakamu to be, right? This using the IMF as Kakamu to be to push Ghanaians into something they may not want. If we say we are capable of managing without a fund, why are we bringing them back in conversation? That's my point.
But you can understand the government's own aversion. Maybe they are using it as a scare, but you can understand the government's own aversion to the IMF issue because of how much political capital they made out of it.
Senna, can you point to one country in Africa which does not have an aversion to IMF? Can you point to one country? Right? And as legend will have it, in Ghana, and it's not too far to even talk about legends. When, in 1982 to 83, and I think we must reflect on these things in order that we can make a development, where people in Ghana not making a joke of the Rawlings administration, which they called Charlie Watte and other things. Were they not making a joke at the time that they had run to the IMF as left of center parties, as communists and whatever? Do you recall that debate? It's still recounted that it was never the wish of the late president to go to the IMF. And that's our history. So it's never the wish of any government to go to the IMF. It comes down to managing well. And I believe strongly that we could have managed well, right, with 3 oil fields. Let's not forget that this administration has gotten more oil revenue, or had gotten more oil revenue in 3 years than the Mills Mahama administration put together in 8 years. So it's not for lack of revenue. The barrels of oil, even if they were selling at the point where we left off in 2015, 2016, which was dismissed. Remember, it was dismissed as non-performance. It was 70,000, and we were struggling because of the tariff bearing from one oil field, Jubilee. We were struggling with that. Has increased to nearly 200,000 barrels per day. So it's not that anything fortuitous has not happened to this government. It took over ESLA. There were $200 million US in the sinking fund, which was used to pay the balance on the first sovereign bond issued by His Excellency President Kufuor. Of course, it's oil money. He played his part in giving us the oil. So there's nothing wrong with using, part of that money to pay. It was done quietly. We used 335 million or 36 million to start taking it off. And then we refinanced from our bonds. We didn't bring the money into consumption. 250 million. And we left 200 million plus, which was used to pay for that on October 4th, 2017. Remember, the bond was issued in 2007. So it isn't as if, benefits have not flowed to this administration. No. Right? So the best way to avoid the IMF is to manage your affairs. That's all. And if we were capable, we couldn't have gone to the fund, for the loan. And our position on that the economic situation was worse, than, before COVID. And that's what's been proving out now. Otherwise, with over $4 billion that we got, from the IMF, World Bank, and other sources, why have we not been able to, to resolve the COVID crisis, which was the main thing, and then move on and put the economy back on even keel? And that's why I'm saying that we should also begin to examine the expenditures. And some of your listeners have already, given examples.
Well, perhaps I should conclude by then asking you whether you think the situation would ever get any better if this budget is approved in the manner in which it is.
It will be difficult, and I think I've given numbers, to show why, I I believe in what I'm saying, and if I may, for the benefit of your viewers who may be seeing, the screen, which maybe you can show later. If I go down on this, and sorry, it appears I'm having some difficulty. Yes, okay. Now, this particular screen, which you see here, you see that we have revenue. This is the money that is coming in, the 100 billion we are talking about, right? Now, that revenue, and this is 2021 budget, how government expects 2021 to end, and then how what is being projected for 2022. And you can see that the 2021 budget is already estimated. Anywhere you see red, it means borrowing. So what we did here was cumulatively to subtract the expenditures one by one from the total revenue, and then ask ourselves at which point will that revenue be exhausted, right? At which point will the revenue be exhausted? And that is when the black, changes to red. And so you can see that it is not new what we are talking about. And we debated, we know, we've been discussing it already. So in the budget itself for 2021, it was estimated that the revenue that came in could pay for, 17, the compensation. But then if we were to follow without borrowing, from interest all the way down, the items I mentioned a while ago, compensation, interest, other expenditures for running government, capital expenditure, arrears, discrepancy, which can be plus or minus, exceptional expenditure like the bailout cost, which is pushed down here, and then the IMF SDR, which is flowing in, I mentioned, in only will come in 2022, which I said was one time, the green here. You can see that we are carrying this situation into the future. And that if you adjust for some of the things which I'm talking about, right, the 100 billion year being ambitious, this is what I was talking about. You are carrying the thing from 70 to 100 billion, when in actual fact, you had for the 2021 budget, the budget was 72, and then and you even had to reduce it in 2021 to 70, and you are expecting to do 70. How can you increase it? And 2021 is supposed to have been post-COVID, and we are being told, growth is coming up and had come up and everything. So I'm saying, Senna, this situation, if you do adjust here, you come to this situation where the red will move up. And therefore, all this is borrowed. So if you're asking me, well, what I think about the future, whether it's going to be difficult, I'm using the government's own numbers and the extent to which we borrow to answer the question. And these are from budgets, please. They are not, from our own calculation. So, yes.